Hi, I'm Tim, welcome to our channel, and thanks for logging on. Today, it's dueling dual-time watches from the early 2000s. Omega Seamaster GMT versus Rolex Explorer II Polar. Let the games begin. Okay, starting with the Omega because it's the lesser known of the two. This is a timepiece based on a Seamaster GMT platform that debuted back in 1998. That's where we got the bigger indices, the broadsword style hands. It uses the basic style of the James Bond Omega Seamaster, also known as the Diver 300M that debuted in 1993 and broke onto the big screen with Pierce Brosnan in 1995. But this is a very different dial architecture, and you can see this one, not strictly speaking a dive watch, shorn of the helium escape valve. It's just as water resistant and just as precise and mechanically similar, but the timepiece is different in several important respects, starting with the lack of the warthog appurtenance on the flank. Now the timepiece is a bit bigger than the Rolex. This is about a 41.5mm watch, even though in most places it's listed as a 41. It does feel broader on the wrist. Zooming out a little bit, you can see on my 16cm circumference wrist, the Seamaster GMT is a timepiece that wears with impressive presence, looking more like a 42 or a 43 on the wrist. It's a timepiece that will fit wrists, in my estimation, as small as 14cm circumference. You can see that lug-to-lug, it's a watch that measures 47.5mm, but that's just the case. If you measure the solid end links of the bracelet, you can see how much swell they add over the edge of the lugs. The watch actually comes out to 53.2mm from end link to end link, and the end links, of course, are solid here. The watch is reasonably slim, at least by 2019 Omega Seamaster standards. 13.6mm means that the early 2000s Seamaster GMT was slightly thinner than today's standard Diver 300M chronometer. The spacing between the lugs is 20mm, so that would be the size if you wish to accessorize. That said, the bracelet that's fitted to the GMT is distinctly different from the one on the standard watch, and I feel it's a bit more sporting in its appearance. It has oval cross section, satin finished links, and you can see they're satin finished from every angle. The edge of the links also sharply squared off in a way that the standard Diver 300 bracelet is not, and the standard Diver 300 is interspersed with rolled edge shoulder links and polished intermediate centers. So it looks a little bit like a hybrid between a dress watch and a sports watch. That's not the case here. This is a sports watch bracelet. You can see in the early 2000s, Omega used pin sleeves for sizing its bracelets. It's a rugged and dependable system, but it does require you to have a punch and a block if you want to do sizing on your own. The clasp was awesome. By the standards of the day, this was the clasp that forced Rolex to reconsider clasps. You can see it's milled out from the solid with trigger release, not a cheap clamshell system. Internally, there is a dive extension system, even though this is not strictly speaking a dive watch. You have the same basic extension that you would find on the Diver 300M, which means even if you're not going to take it diving and put it over a wetsuit or a dry suit, you can use it to throw the extension open and then fit it over a winter coat if you want to go sledding or out in the snow during cold months, as I did when I owned the Diver 300M in New Hampshire during my college years. Jump into the case side, you can see that the shape is familiar, but it's different in one key respect. It's all of satin finish. There's no polish on this case. Everything is subdued, and you can see that's right down to the satin finished crown, which has no polished facet. It reduces glare, but it also gives the watch a more discreet appearance and makes it look a bit more contemporary, as the high polish of the original threads the needle between dress watch and sports watch status. This is no Diver 300M, and you can see that is certainly the case when the lack of the helium escape valve becomes evident. Some folks like the clean look of the GMT better. And the bezel of this watch is bidirectional. Not a dive bezel. It is the crispest bidirectional bezel I've ever encountered. Listen, you can even hear how good it is. This is the only case I know of where a company has used the same quality of ratchet that they used on their dive watches on a GMT bezel. Now, of course, if you set the 24-hour red hand to Greenwich Mean Time, you can use the local airport or port offset in conjunction with this bezel, which features a matte aluminum insert. You can use that bezel to find a third time zone temporarily. I'm going to do my best to show the detail of the dial. There is a matte white finish, and you can see a very subtle embossed Geneva wave, that Omega wave pattern that made the Diver 300M famous. It's here, it's just faint. Now you will note one of the thoughtful details is that Omega added a tricolor dial. You have black, you have white, and you have red. So it's a lively dial, and I would even say it's a little bit of a tropical look. Not tropical dial in the sense of aging, but tropical tropical in the sense that it has a light and lively countenance. All of the indices are also black bordered, which ensures that despite the fact their tone is similar to the dial itself, contrast remains excellent, and one of the changes for this dial style was the addition of the broadsword hands along with the maxi indices. You have that 1224 dual time functionality. The watch remains 300 meters water resistant, and of course you can set the local hour hand, even jumping the date backwards and forwards as you transit the international date line. Underneath the case back, Omega caliber 1128. It's a modified 2892, and it is a dual time movement with a 44-hour power reserve, automatic winding. You have the stop seconds function, you have the 12-24-hour dual time functionality, the COSC Swiss chronometer certification, and of course the 300-meter water resistance with the Omega Waves and the Hippocampus Seahorse on the reverse side. Let's talk about the Rolex. This is a watch you know well, and you can see just sitting in my light box, the Luminova has been energized to the point where it is already visibly phosphorescing. The timepiece, of course, introduced in 1988, the successor to the transitional 16550. This example shows some of the later features and some of the original features. I'll explain each in turn, but first let's talk about the fit. Throwing this watch on my wrist, you can see my 16 centimeter circumference wrist wears the watch fairly easily. It is smaller than the Omega in every respect. 40 millimeters versus 41.5. You can see that in profile this is a 12 millimeter thick watch rather than 13.6, and because lug-to-lug, we measure two different ways. 47.6 millimeters if you just measure the case across the wrist, and if you measure the solid end links of the bracelet, you're going to find that the distance across the wrist is a robust but still very wearable 50.3 millimeters. So this is one of the later Explorer II 16570's, a Y series, in the sense that it has the solid end link bracelet and it has the post-1998 Luminova dial rather than the tritium. However, we still have the apertures in the flanks of the lugs. For those who want to use strap tools to change to a strap, you can easily remove the bracelet. This is a vestige of the watch's original design, and you can see that there are some marks and scratches on this watch, but for the most part the metal is all intact with some evidence of the original factory beveling still present. I will always prefer an honest factory metal timepiece versus one that has been polished to perfection, and you can see this one's in very good shape. Lug-wise, the metal is full and even, the lugs are symmetrical from side to side. The case band is more slender than the Omega, but also a little bit less nuanced, as there's no beveling and there is no lyre style profile at the end. The crown guard is simple, and the Rolex twin lock crown is a signature of this model. The dial is polar white. There were always two options. After the transitional 16550, you had your black or you had your white. The white is truly white, not silver. And the indices as well as the hands are blackened. You have a radially satin finished bezel that features 24 hours. Unlike the Omega, it does not move. Then under the case back, you have the 31 jewel automatic winding 48-hour power reserve Rolex caliber 3185, COSC chronometer, full balance bridge, free spring index, overcoil hairspring adjusted in 5 positions. The overcoil is a refinement that the Omega lacks, so that's worth noting. And of course 100 meter water resistance here, a stop second function, and the 12-24-hour dual time functionality. So let's talk about the advantages of each of these watches. I'm going to throw the Rolex on the wrist real quick, and then we'll talk about the advantages of the Rolex. The Rolex, as you can see, wears more easily on a smaller wrist. The Rolex has a fit and a feel that's both more comfortable on a smaller wrist and more graceful, in the sense that the slender profile of the watch wears better with a tight cuff. So advantages: it's a slimmer, more elegant case in every regard. It is the choice between the two if you have a smaller wrist. I imagine the Rolex could be worn successfully on a wrist as small as 13.5 centimeters circumference. The Omega, especially on the bracelet, not so much. Rolex prestige: for some folks, luxury watches are about status and stature. The Rolex name has the blue chip factor that even Omega, as renowned as it is, can't quite match. I'll also mention that this is a timepiece that is a better long-term bet, as in the long run, the Rolex is going to be the one that likely gains value, becomes a true vintage classic, and passes into the canonical profile of classic Rolex watches alongside the subs, the GMTs, and the Daytonas. The Omega Seamaster GMT is more of a curiosity and a historical footnote. Let's talk about the timepiece having a more sophisticated caliber. Between the Breguet overcoil architecture and the full balance bridge, plus an extra 4 hours of power reserve, the Rolex caliber is more sophisticated, and it's also smoother with jeweled staff winding and twin Teflon coated reversing wheels. I have to say that the Rolex is both a more silent winder and overall a more sophisticated caliber, plus the manufacturer caliber 3185 is made entirely by Rolex, whereas the Omega caliber 1128 is essentially a modified movement provided by ETA. Not a big deal, but for some, that will be a difference maker. And finally, a more enduring design. This essential Explorer II design dates back to 1971 in the first examples. The bottom line is that this look is still present in the current 2019 watch, and every future version of the Explorer II will preserve the styling essence of this design. The Omega, well, the Omega has an enduring case shape, and in some respects the Bond Seamaster has endured, but this is not the design that has had the legs. It's been the more traditional skeleton hand, round index Bond. So this is a timepiece that is interesting to Omega collectors, but not strictly speaking an enduring classic. That said, we do have plenty of advantages here. Let's talk about the clasp quality. Right here you can see why I give Omega clasp quality out of hand. A fully milled clasp, a machined swing arm. Compare that to what Rolex was offering back in the day. Comparatively speaking, this stamped clasp and folding swing arm with clamshell system, it feels like tinsel on the wrist and in the hand. The clamshell system, relative to what Omega was providing back in the early 2000s, looks and feels cheap, whereas the Omega is not just a milled out solid block of steel, but it uses twin trigger release. The fold out extension, again, this is not a dive watch, but it's nice to have the dive extension built in. That's an advantage. It should be mentioned that although the Rolex bracelet is sized using screws, it feels, even though this one is wonderfully intact, less redoubtable. It doesn't have the solidity of the Omega bracelet. So even though Omega is using the more awkward pin sleeve system, the bracelet that you get once it's on the wrist and sized feels like a more expensive product. I'll also mention that this is a timepiece with a rotating bezel. You can use it and roughly approximate timing as long as you're not using it for diving. You could still line it up with the minute hand, and now you could just pretend that 6 is 15 and 12 is 30 and of course 18 is 45, and you can use it as a timing organ. You can also use it as intended to gauge temporarily 3 time zones. That's a functionality that the Rolex does not have. In terms of lume, the Omega wins running away. Bigger plots of superluminova versus considerably smaller plots on the Rolex. While the Rolex lume does seem supercharged because even in the light you can see it glowing, the bottom line is that this one will win the lume shot later in the review, and you'll see that to good effect. I'll also mention that this is a timepiece that in many respects represents a superior value proposition. It's a bigger watch for those who want more wrist presence as well. The timepiece wearing more like a 42, and with the span across the wrist and the solid end links, this is one for a big wrist, not just moderately sized wrists like my own. If you don't want to step up to a 43 or a 44, you can go with this classically proportioned 41.5 and get the same visual effect. So you guys let me know in the box below, which of these would you make your own? The Rolex, more dear, or the Omega, the better value? Between the two, give me the Omega. I love the Diver 300s. I love the fact that this has one of the crispest rotating bezels I've ever encountered on a GMT. The timepiece feels more expensive. It has a better bracelet. It has a better clasp. It has sentimental value to me because I owned one of the original Diver 300 meters, and even though it doesn't have an in-house caliber, my bet is that if you were to put these two into a chronometry test and a torture test, this movement would not just be as accurate and as shock resistant, but in a 300 meter water resistant case versus a 100 meter water resistant case, advantage Omega, and that's why it's my choice. Sound off and let me know of your choice in the box below. The lume shot. The Rolex, which is bright, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't pack the punch of the Omega. So what's the value differential between the two? For the Rolex, you're going to pay $7,000 to $8,000 pre-owned today for a good example. For the Omega, by comparison, you're going to pay between $2,000 and $3,000. So from a value standpoint, advantage Omega.